It sounds really good. A little bit of ring there, I don't know, there. That's a little better. Thank you, Betty, for leading us in the prayer. I just had a feeling if I'll just sit still, if I don't jump up there, then one of you will come up and lead us in prayer, which I encourage you. That's a good thing to do. And you are always welcome to help us with that. It's a myth that God only hears the pastor's prayers. And that's one thing that we as a church, as a movement, going way back to Martin Luther, we've always believed in the priesthood of all believers. You heard that phrase before? That means that every one of us can come boldly before the throne of God and can pray prayers of intercession for other people. And it doesn't mean that only a set-aside priest can do that. It means we are all priests, and that we all can do that. And so that was one thing I had to work on really hard in Mexico, because with their very Catholic culture, they automatically have the idea that only a pastor could intercede for other people. And so there's something, they believed there was something magical about my prayers and my words. And I said, you can pray this just as well as I can. So anyway, that was not my sermon today. That's not the message. What I want to do today is we are finishing. Today is the last of an 8-week study. I don't know if it has seemed longer than 8 weeks to you. Maybe it felt like the entire summer that we were working on this book from Benji Kelley called Wrecked and Redeemed, and told the story a few times about how he, at the age of 17, found redemption, found his life changed after he had wrecked it. And he was only 17 years old and was in jail and was reading the Gospel of John when he found Jesus. And so that's why this book studies from the Gospel of John, and we've looked at several chapters and selected passages. And so now we're coming to the end, and we're going to get to the final, well, I hate to say it that way, but reminding ourselves again, the theme of this book has been about Jesus being full of grace and truth. And so we've kind of gone back and forth on those two things, and with a lot of emphasis on grace and also on truth. And so today we get to the final truth. And the final, and it's a good truth, it's a good news. And so it is a truth that is also full of grace, and it's for all of us. And so the title of this last chapter is called This Changes Everything. This truth that we're going to look at today. It changes everything. Have you ever had one of those moments when something comes along and you think to yourself, this changes everything? I mean, those are you don't get very many of those in your lifetime. You might think you do, but there's really only just a very few. Sometimes it's a tragedy. And this changes everything from that moment on. Sometimes it's a blessing. It's a good thing. I'm sure most of you can identify with the picture on the screen. And that moment when you discover, or your wife tells you that she might be pregnant for the very first time. I still remember that. I remember that yeah, you guys remember it too, don't you? And Susie and I, we were a couple of years into our marriage, and we were hoping it would happen, and it wasn't happening. And we would think, okay, it might have happened, and then it didn't happen. And so we were starting to think maybe this will never happen. And so I still remember the time when she came to me and showed me the test, and I don't remember exactly what kind of a test it was, and it had the plus sign or the two things or whatever. All I remember is that she told me, I think it has happened. I think we are going to have a baby. And we both thought to ourselves, and I thought, and I said, if this is true, this changes everything, right? And it did. It changed everything. Because from that moment on, we went into baby mode. You know what baby mode is, don't you? You start building, feathering the nest, you start working, you start preparing, and in fact, for the last 22 years, we have been in baby mode because it changed everything. Right up until a week ago Friday, when the last of our little birdies left the nest and went on to college. And now, I'm kind of feeling like, hey, this changes everything again. This is not the same anymore.
Time for another one.
No. It's time for grandchildren eventually, but maybe that will be the next this changes everything moment. I don't know. It will be, huh? Yeah. There are moments, right? There are things in life that come along. Even if you go back in history, there are historical events in a country that change everything, or world events. Just this past summer, we celebrated 50 years from the moon landing, when the first man stepped on the moon. And I still don't remember it, but I watched the documentaries and all the incredible footage, and Walter Cronkite on the news, who took off his glasses and wiped his face. He said, phew, because he knew this changes everything. And he said it. He said, from now on, we live in a world where man has left this planet and has stepped on another world. This changes everything, he said. And then most of us remember September 11th, 2001. It's hard to believe, but this week will be 17 years, right? And that was a tragic event, and it changed everything. And we are still feeling the results of that change. So, there's events like that are historical, life events, things like that happen. Can you guess what is the most changing event in all of history, of world history, going back 10,000 years? It's the truth that we're going to look at today. What would that truth be?
Resurrection?
The resurrection. That changed everything. So we're going to look at John chapter 20, and we're going to look at the resurrection of Jesus. You've heard of Christmas in July. Today we're doing Easter in September. How's that? Because it is the most important truth ever. It's the ultimate truth. And it changed everything. So look with me at John chapter 20. We're going to, there's several different stories you can read, but this one is just so amazing. It's the one that Pastor Benji focuses on, the story of Mary Magdalene. And it says in verse 11, Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they've put him." At this, she turned around and she saw Jesus standing there. But she did not realize that it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you've put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said, do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news. "I have seen the Lord," she said. And she told them that he had said these things to her. So that's the moment, that's the thing that in our chapter that we're looking at today from Pastor Benji changes everything. This changes everything. In fact, just quoting a little bit of what he wrote in that chapter, he said, if Jesus, I do have it on the screen, Jesse, on the next one. There it is. If Jesus really was crucified on the cross to pay for your sin debt and mine, this changes everything. If Jesus literally was dead and buried in a borrowed tomb for 3 days, but then all of a sudden he rose from the dead, this changes everything. And then he goes on from there. I didn't get it all on the screen, but he said, if he really walked through walls and ate sushi on the shores of Galilee, fish anyway, and ascended into heaven before the startled eyes of his first followers, this changes everything. And it did. It is the one event in all of history that has marked history forever and has changed everything. In fact, the resurrection is what makes Christianity as a religion unique among all religions of the world. It is the only religion that talks about a resurrection, the resurrection of our founder, of Jesus Christ. And so that truth is uniquely important. It is incredibly important. It changes everything, and everything hinges on that truth. If it is true, it changes everything. If it's not true, then nothing matters. All what we believe does not matter. In fact, Pastor Benji, so I love to quote C.S. Lewis, but I try to refrain because I do it too often. But Pastor Benji did it, so I'm going to show you the quote that he mentions in his book. He says, Christianity, if false, is of no importance. And if true, it's of infinite importance. The only thing it cannot be is moderately important. Wow. It's either all or nothing, If this happened, it changes everything. And if it didn't happen, nothing matters. And nothing changes. So we're going to look at that today, and I know maybe part of what you might be asking, or what other people might ask, well, if this changes everything, then like what? What are you talking about? What does that change? What's the difference between pre-resurrection and the world that we live in today? Okay, so here's a sermon about everything, all right? I can do a whole sermon on everything. The resurrection, if it is true, then the first thing we know is that heaven and hell are real. And that changes everything. Heaven and hell are real, and it changes the whole trajectory of our lives. All of life suddenly becomes eternally significant. It has meaning and purpose in every little thing that we do. And it changes our life. It changes the trajectory or the direction or the pathway. Just like when we found out that we were going to have a baby, we went into baby mode. It changed everything. Suddenly we were working on the house, we were saving up some money, we were buying toys and diapers and you name it. We changed everything. Because it changed the trajectory of your life. That's what Jesus resurrection does for us, because it's eternally significant. If there's a heaven and a hell, then our lives have to reflect that. And it changes what we do. Benji wrote his book, this changes how we live, how we love, how we spend our time, how we spend our money. This changes our life. It truly changes everything. And it certainly changed the life of Mary Magdalene. That's what we're going to focus on a little bit today. That her life changed a lot. Now, look at the next slide, Jesse. We don't really know a lot about Mary Magdalene. She's a fascinating character in the Gospels, but we never hear from her very much. She doesn't give many lines except this one. I seen the Lord, and she doesn't. We don't see much of her or hear about her, except that the fact that she is mentioned by name more than 12 times in all the Gospels, which is way more than the majority of the disciples. Isn't that fascinating? We get the names of the disciples in a couple places, and then we hear about Pete, Jim, and John, but we don't hear too much about the rest of them, except if they do something bad. And then we hear a lot about this Mary Magdalene, but we still don't know too much about her. And it's fascinating that she all of a sudden ends up at the scene of the resurrection, and in, I think it's Matthew as well as John that we just read. According to those two, she is the first one to see Jesus after he rose. She's the first one. She is the first witness. She's like the first evangelist. Literally, the word evangelist means someone who carries good news. So she's the first one who took the good news and said, I've seen the Lord. I know that he has risen. So we know that, from this passage alone, her life and her significance in history changes completely. In fact, there's really a lot of significance built into this that we in our society don't realize, because in those days, how were women considered? You know what they were thought?
Lowly.
Pretty lowly. Second-class citizens, maybe even lower than that. And they weren't considered to be reliable witnesses. I mean, you would never bring a woman to court and use her as your witness in your favor, because nobody would believe her. So it's pretty significant that the very first witness mentioned in the scriptures, in the Gospels, is a woman, Mary Magdalene. And suddenly that raises her significance and her status. In fact, later on, the church down through the centuries is going to name her almost like an apostle. In some of the Eastern churches and the tradition that goes way back to the apostolic fathers, they list her along with some of the other apostles because she was the first witness. So it changed everything about that. But even before that, let's go back to her life that we know about before the resurrection. We know that a lot of people speculated about what she was like and who she was. Some think that she was a rich woman and that she financed the ministry of Jesus. That might have been possible, very possible. Others think that she was a prostitute, maybe a very, very sinful woman. Some think that she was the woman who anointed Jesus' feet. Remember that story? Poured perfume on it, cried, wiped his feet with her tears and her hair. And some think that was Mary Magdalene, although the scriptures do not say that. The only thing that the scriptures actually say about her life before she met Jesus was that she was possessed by 7 demons. One passage says 7 demons came out of her. And then Mark's long ending, the last part of Mark, says that Jesus cast 7 demons out of Mary Magdalene. And that's all we know. We don't really know much about her life before that. And we just get these little bits and pieces where she was always one of the women that was involved in the events of his life. But we know that she was demon-possessed. She met Jesus, and he cast those demons out of her life, and suddenly she is front and center of the whole ministry of Jesus. And we do know that those demons never came back. They changed her life forever. But you have to wonder, I wonder about this. This wasn't even in Benji's book, but I thought about it. When she saw Jesus crucified, in fact, she was one of the, consistently in all four Gospels, she is one of the women who is named at the crucifixion. Even the disciples didn't do that. She was there. And she saw him crucified. She saw him die. And you have to wonder, and maybe I'm just thinking too much through this, but surely she must have started asking herself, was this real? Was this whole thing real? I mean, all of a sudden it's coming to an end, and nobody expected Jesus to die, or unless they had listened to him when he predicted it. But she probably started asking herself, what about this change in my life? Was it real? Will it last? Now? Will the demons come back? I wonder if she thought that. Maybe that's part of what was worrying her so much. And I know a big part of this because she just loved Jesus so much, and she just wanted to find his body. And that's why she was at the tomb. But I just wondered if she was thinking to herself, is this real? And was Jesus really God? Did he really have all this power and authority? And when he cast those demons out of me, what's going to keep them from coming back now? And that could have happened. She probably was very concerned about that. So that was the significance, or part of it, of finding Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, when she met him. And she realized, and she got her question answered. Yes, Mary, this was real. Yes, Mary, heaven and hell are real. And your life really has been changed permanently for good. The authority and the power of Jesus is real. And those demons will not come back. They can't. Because my power is still working in you. That's why Paul the Apostle goes on to talk about this power of the resurrection to change our lives. Pastor Benji does talk about it in his book, the fact that he said in his life, those personal demons of drug and alcohol addiction often threatened to come back. We've seen this, haven't we? That's the nature of addiction. It's the nature of even demon possession. Once you're free, you're never free. There's always this feeling, always this possibility that it's going to come back. And Benji writes in his book, he said, he says, I'm shortening it down just to say that they never came back. That doesn't mean I wasn't worried, that it wasn't a struggle, that it wasn't a temptation. But because of the resurrection power of Jesus in his life, it really changed everything. And those demons never came back. We all have demons, don't we? Or temptations, or things we were talking about it this morning, weren't we? There's just, every one of us has some kind of a addiction, if you want to call it that way, to sin. But Jesus says, I have power, I have authority over that. And the resurrection proves it. It changes everything. It changes our whole life. And we don't have to be defined by our demons, by our past, by our weaknesses. We are defined by our relationship with Jesus. That changed. That's actually the second one. Go on to number 2. If the resurrection really happened, you're going to find out that every one of my points starts with heaven and hell are real. That's what Mary found out, that the hell of her demon possession was real, but that she escaped it through Jesus. And she found heaven, both present and future. Heaven and hell are real, and the hope of heaven is found in a personal relationship with Jesus. Personal. That's the important part of this idea. Everything that we ever thought about religion and salvation from before Jesus, what they thought, and people after Jesus, what has been going on down through the centuries. The belief that religion is all about a set of standards and beliefs and doctrines, and if you believe in these facts, and then that will be what saves you. No, none of that does. In fact, you can even believe in the fact of the resurrection, and that doesn't save you. What saves you is a personal relationship with the one who was resurrected. It starts with that truth. And if that truth is real, if it's true, then it changes everything, including religion and everything we ever believed about it. And that's what we see with Mary and Jesus. Apparently, again, we have to just read through and read between the lines, but we know that they must have had a close personal relationship. And we read these verses and we see it here, and later on we're going to see that Jesus does this with not just Mary, but the other disciples too. He did it with Mary first, which is still very incredible, but later on he's going to have these personal, touching moments with his disciples. In fact, in the same chapter, right after we see the encounter with Mary, the next thing that happens is that Jesus appears to these disciples that were cowering in fear, hidden behind locked doors, and Jesus comes through the wall or through the locked door, and he ministers to them. And then a little bit later on, he has a very personal encounter with Thomas. In fact, the only time we ever hear anything about Thomas is this encounter, because Thomas doubted. And so Jesus personally touches him and says, "You can touch my hands and my feet." And then in the next chapter, we have this incredible, long, one-on-one encounter between Jesus and Peter. Remember that one? Why was that so important? What did Peter do? He denied Jesus 3 times. And so for 3 times, Jesus asked Peter, "Do you love me?" Talk about personal. I mean, this is a personal relationship. And Jesus, very intentionally, after the resurrection, he made personal contact with these people, starting with Mary. And so I just want to spend a moment talking about Mary's encounter. Again, next slide, Jesse. Mary found that her hope of heaven and hell are real, that her hope is in this personal relationship with Jesus, which she had, which we see, especially in verse 16. This verse always fascinates me. I love it. The fact that here she is trying to find his body. She thinks he's dead. She thinks that somebody's stolen him from the tomb. She thinks maybe the gardener moved him. And so she asks him, "Sir, where have you put him? And I'll go get him. I'll take care of him." And Jesus says one word to her. One word. What was that word?
Mary.
Mary. Her personal name. And it's immediately, through all the tears that she couldn't see very well, and through all her fears that maybe these demons were going to come back, all the doubts that were probably going through her mind right now, all of a sudden it all just fell away. And she recognized her master's voice. And she turns and she cries out to him, Rabboni, which I've always wondered, what is that word? Rabbi means teacher, but I looked it up, and Rabboni, a little bit longer form of it, means my great teacher, my great master. So we actually see the type of relationship that Mary and Jesus had. It wasn't anything romantic like you sometimes see in very liberal theology and movies. It was this master relationship, a teacher and student and leader and disciple. But it was very close and very, very, very personal. In fact, that's kind of what Jesus is trying to get across when he tells her, I'm ascending to my Father and your Father. I'm ascending to my God and your God. My Master, my Lord. So very personal. And this is the farthest thing from cold doctrinal religion. It's so very personal. And again, my mind thinks too much and I go down these rabbit trails, but I've got to go down one again today. Because you look at this passage and it's kind of strange because Jesus says to her, don't touch me, right? Don't hold on to me because I haven't yet ascended to my Father. And I think, what is that about? That is so weird because later when Jesus does appear to his disciples, he says, hey, touch me. Look at me. I can eat. I can talk. You can feel me. But when he's talking to Mary, he says, don't touch me. I'm not ready for that yet. That's kind of weird. And the only thing I can think of, and this is just my mind speculating, is that maybe Mary caught him mid-resurrection. He was still on his way up. From down in the depths and the grave and hell, he was on his way up to the Father. And she caught him. Well, more likely, he saw her. And saw that she was distressed and worried and all these fears and tears. And he says, Mary, I've got to stop. Just a moment, I've got to talk to her. And so in the middle of his resurrection, he stops because of this personal relationship with Mary. He takes a moment to speak her name and to call her by name. And to me, that's incredible. That's very, very personal. And to think that he does the same thing for each of us. He calls us by name. He personally calls us to be his disciples and to follow him. And that's what the hope of heaven is all about. It's not what you believe. It starts there. If this is true, if you can believe it, then it changes everything. And the change that happens is that suddenly it's personal. Suddenly it's a relationship with Jesus Christ, and that's what saves us. Not what we believe or don't believe. Well, it does start there. You got to believe in the resurrection first. But if it's true, then heaven and hell are real, and our hope of heaven is this relationship with Jesus Christ. So the third thing I want to mention out of this passage is it's actually the main focus of the chapter that Benji wrote in his book. If it's true, if Jesus rose from the dead and the resurrection really happened, then heaven and hell are real. And we have an urgent message to share. This is good news, and it's also very urgent news. First thing Jesus said to her, he said to Mary, go and tell my brothers verse 17. And then it says, Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news. That's that evangelism thing that just means carrier of good news. And she shouts, I have seen the Lord. Good news. Great message. And so very urgent. In fact, if you read the whole chapter, the context of this chapter is full of urgency. Everybody's running. You ever notice that? In this chapter, everybody's running back and forth. In fact, it starts off at the beginning of the chapter. Mary goes to the tomb, apparently not running at that moment, but she goes very, very early. She goes to the tomb, and the tomb's empty. The door's open. And so she runs back to the disciples. I don't know how she knew where they were, but maybe they had this secret hiding place that they all met together. And so she ran back to get them. And she says, the tomb's empty. I don't know where they took him. Somebody took Jesus. And Peter and John heard that. And what do? They ran back to the tomb. In fact, I love that picture. Was that the previous slide, Jesse, with the picture of... no, there it is. There's the urgent message. There's Peter and John. I love this painting because I think it's a painting, not actually a movie still, but it's a painting of Peter and John running to the tomb. And you can see Peter with this incredibly frantic look on his face. He just can't wait to get there. And then it looks like maybe John is following behind him. And John is the younger guy in this, and he knows he can outrun Peter at any moment, right? It's like he's toying with Peter. I'll let Peter get a head start and let him think he's winning, but then I'm going to catch up and beat him. In fact, John actually writes that in this passage, that Peter and John ran to the tomb, but I got there first. Wow, that's an amazing thing. But it just talks about this incredible urgency that was going on through this whole thing. So Peter and John get to the tomb, and they see it's empty. And Peter runs inside the tomb, and he finds the grave clothes, and they're all folded up, and Jesus is nowhere nearby. And so both Peter and John run back to the disciples. And in the very next scene, Mary's back at the tomb again. So again, I read between the lines and I think they must have crossed each other. Because Peter and John go from the disciples to the tomb after Mary ran to the disciples. And it's looking like Peter and John outran Mary, and she's running back to the tomb. And before she can get back to the tomb, they head back towards the disciples again. And they must have just went right past her. I don't know. Maybe they did. Maybe they never saw her. Maybe they did. Possibly they simply ignored her because she was a woman, right? And the next scene we see is Mary standing at the same empty tomb with the same angels sitting there. And she's still in tears because she has not made the connection like Peter and John already did, that Jesus must have risen from the dead. It says right there that Peter and John believed. So Mary hadn't figured that out yet. But when she does have this encounter with Jesus, it changes everything. And then she knows heaven and hell are real, and I've got to tell people. I've got this incredible message to share. I have seen the Lord, she said. In fact, those are really the same messages that we have today. It's really part one and part two of the same message. Our message is the same one. Heaven and hell are real. And here's how we know it. Because I have seen the Lord. I have a personal story to tell. Now, it may not be the same as Mary's, right? Maybe you haven't had 7 demons in you. I know I haven't had 7 demons that I know of. And I don't have the exact same story, but I have a story too. I saw Jesus. Well, maybe not physically with my own eyes, but he touched me. He changed me. And if we can't tell people that, then we really don't have a message to share. I have encountered the Lord in one way or another. And that's part one of our message. It's just our testimony. This is what happened to me. And the second part of our message is come and see. You can see him too. Here's where he is. Come and see. Come and check it out. You can just imagine that this was Mary's story for the rest of her life. She was probably known by this testimony, that everywhere she went, she probably said, I saw Jesus while he was ascending, or in the middle of his resurrection. I know heaven and hell are real. And I can tell you how to get to heaven. She became known as an apostle. So she shared this message. And that was the part two of it, to go ahead and make the invitation. The invite. That's what we do. We're not pushing, we're not, converting anybody. That's not what we do. What we simply do is say, I've seen the Lord, you can see him too. Come and see. It could be an invitation to church. Hopefully, you can do that. It might be just an invitation to join in a conversation. Have you ever opened up a spiritual conversation with somebody? A lot of times people do it with me, whether I want to or not. I'm kind of the reluctant witness sometimes. Oh, you're a pastor. Oh, well, let me talk to you about this. And so I get a lot of that. But sometimes that's what we need to do, is just open up an invitation to talk about spiritual things. And I know it's not easy in this world, because there are a lot of people who have a lot of different beliefs, and we live in a society that says every belief is equally true. Right? I was just talking with Dawn, Bill's wife, and Dawn, I think it was Friday, she was telling me about how she was talking to her friend. And her friend said to her, I believe there's a heaven, but I don't believe there's a hell. And Dawn gave her a really good answer. She said, well, both of those ideas come from the Bible. If you believe in one, you have to really believe in the other. And that was a pretty good answer. But I would also, if I'm talking to somebody about things like heaven and hell, and they say that, which is very, very common today, a lot of people believe that exact same thing. I would say to them, are you sure? How do you know that's true? Because if that's true, it changes everything. Right? And basically, it doesn't matter what you believe if that's true. Because then you can live any way you want to. It doesn't matter if you go to church. It doesn't matter if you live a Christian life. It doesn't matter what you do. If there's no hell, it doesn't matter what you believe. I would say to that person, wow, what a great religion. Let's talk about it. I want to join your thinking, because how do you know that's true? If you can tell me why you know it's true, I'll join you. But if the other one is true, if Jesus really did raise from the dead, if what the Bible says is true, then there is a heaven and there is a hell. If you don't think Jesus talked about hell, read through the Gospel of Matthew. It talks about hell more in Matthew than anywhere else in the Bible. Jesus taught it. So it's real. We know it. And our message is come and see how to find heaven. And I can show you how to do that. Or just come and see. In fact, that's what we do every year on Friend Day. We do this invitation. Bring your friend, somebody who doesn't go to church. Don't try to steal them from someone else. But bring them, and we will talk on Friend Day. And I will give a very quick and simple message. In fact, I'm still thinking through that message right now, and I'm thinking for the next 2 or 3 weeks I might just concentrate on those two ideas, heaven and hell. Preachers don't preach on hell very much anymore, so I might need to do that. And on Friend Day, 29th of September, the last Sunday, I will just give a very short, simple message how you can find that hope of heaven and to know that it's real. Kind of like what I've already done today. You can do the same thing. You don't even have to wait till then. Okay, here's the conclusion, just to wrap it up again. If Jesus rose from the dead, it changes everything. Heaven and hell are real. No matter what people believe, no matter what they say, heaven and hell are real. And that means life is significant. Everything about life is significant. Everything is important. And that hope of heaven is personal. It's personal with Jesus. That's how you get there. And our message is an urgent one. Because if heaven and hell are real, we need to let people know how to avoid one and get to the other. Right? I don't have to preach that too hard, do I? We really need to. It's so very urgent. So let's stand and pray as we go out. We go out to the mission field. Heavenly Father, here we go. We are reminded again today of the truth of the resurrection and the implications of that. That if that is true, if Jesus did raise from the dead, we know that what the Bible says is true, that heaven and hell are real. And Lord, we are so grateful that we have heard this message and we have seen it. We have seen the Lord and He has made a change in our lives, and every moment of our life is now eternally significant. Remind us of that. Even the smallest things of our lives make a difference for eternity. Lord, give us opportunities and give us courage to open up those spiritual conversations. At least make the invitation to come and see, to hear about Jesus. Lord, remind us again of our own testimonies that you have made a difference and that we do have something to share with those around us. Give us the power of your Holy Spirit, because we can't do this on our own. We pray this in Jesus' name. Thanks, guys. You're